So I took a class this semester on John Milton, which, if you aren't familiar, that's the guy that wrote Paradise Lost, the great Christian epic that kind of tells the tale of Satan's fall from heaven and mankind's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Milton's self-stated aim in Paradise Lost is to justify the ways of God to man. Now, what he's doing there is a theodicy. He's trying to vindicate God's goodness in the face of evil and suffering in the world. Now, of course, if it's God's ways that have to be justified, God is the central player in the theodicy. And so Milton's in a tough spot, right? Because it's potentially blasphemous and irreverent to portray God. And so he's in a tough spot, right? But he goes for it. He portrays God and he has him speak. So the first time God speaks, or the first sort of main time God speaks, is in Book 3 of Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is grouped into 12 sections. Book 3, God makes this big speech about mankind's sin and fall, and how Jesus will eventually be incarnated to redeem mankind, and all that. Now, a lot of people, when they first read that speech, they're kind of put off by the way that God is portrayed. He's portrayed as sort of condescending, severe, harsh, self-righteous. Now, it's a bit silly to say that God is self-righteous, because of course he is perfectly righteous, and so it's almost like a contradiction to say that. But of course, Milton doesn't have to portray him that way, even though he is that way. When I first read it, I felt that Milton could have won over more readers to his theodicy, to his cause, if he would just have, made God out to be more compassionate or soft or empathetic. But Milton doesn't do that. So we're kind of left with this dissatisfaction as a reader towards Milton's God. However, there are many critics that try to defend Milton's position. So, for example, we have somebody we all know and love, C.S. Lewis, right? He has his book, A Preface to Paradise Lost. Quick side note, as I think a lot of people forget that C.S. Lewis was a scholar. They think of him primarily as a novelist, right? Like Chronicles of Narnia. But actually, he was first and foremost a scholar, and I think he specialized more in like Renaissance literature stuff. But he was a professor, and so he wrote this book on Paradise Lost, and in the conclusion he states that, well, if you don't like Milton's God, you just don't like God, because Milton's God is portrayed as sovereign and powerful, and that's what God is, so suck it up. Now, there are other critics that take the same position, right? There's a lesser-known guy called Stanley Fish, and he argues something similar. He says, well, if Milton didn't portray God as infinitely powerful and wrathful, then he would be derelict in his duty, and it's kind of shunning the truth of how God really is. And so there are people trying to defend Milton's God, but as a reader, even though you understand the argument, where they're coming from, you're still kind of dissatisfied. You don't really quite know why Milton couldn't have added in more empathy or compassion to his God. And I felt that way too, until I read a book recommended to me by my professor, or I didn't read the whole thing, I read the first couple chapters, but it's called Imperfect Sense, and it's a book on literary criticism by a lady named Victoria Silver. And although you might argue that her writing leaves a little bit to be desired, I found it hard to get through, but her theology is quite good, so thank goodness for that. So Silver is basically arguing that, we don't understand Milton's view and how he understands God well enough to critique him. So we need to understand the way that Milton thinks about God, and then we can see whether or not he has failed in his theodicy. So the way that Milton primarily understands God is in line with not only Scripture, but also fundamental Protestant theology. And that is that God is fundamentally hidden from humanity. Now, the main scriptural precedent for this is in the book of Job, right? Job is declared to be righteous. He fears God. He does the right thing. And yet, his experience of God is the exact opposite. He loses his entire family and life savings and house and all that stuff. So his experience of God is completely disconnected from what he knows to be true about God, right? So God is infinitely powerful, infinitely good, infinitely loving, infinitely just, and yet he's over here completely sick and he's lost everything. So how does he resolve those two things? Now in the story, Job, he maintains God's goodness throughout that entire experience, and that is what proves his righteousness. But I'll get into that a little bit more in a second here. Sorry, I'm looking down because I got some notes. But there's also other scriptural precedent for the hiddenness of God, right? We have that verse in Isaiah about my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts, right? And then a similar one from Isaiah, where it says something along the lines of, here, if I can see if I can find it, woe to those who quarrel with their maker, who are nothing but potsherds among the potsherds on the ground. Does the clay say to the potter, what are you making? Does the work say, the potter has no hands. Basically, who are you to question God's intentions, right? So these verses, as well as the story of Job, kind of show this disconnect between the way we experience God and the things we know about God. So that's the scriptural precedent. And then we also have Martin Luther. Martin Luther doesn't use the word the hiddenness of God, but he has this similar concept called the mask of God. And he writes, until now we have only dealt with the veiled God, for in this life we cannot deal with God face to face. Now the whole creation is a face or mask of God, but here we need the wisdom that distinguishes God from his mask. The world does not have this wisdom, therefore it cannot distinguish God from his mask. So not only scripture, but also Protestant theology, of which Milton is a part, right? He's part of the Church of England, which is Anglican, right? Protestant. Understand God as hidden from humanity, right? We do not understand his true nature. We are made in his image, but yet there is this ontological gap between creator and creation. Now, I said I wanted to speak a little bit more about justification, and Luther goes on, not in that same passage, but a different passage. He goes on about justification, and in Protestant theology, justification is how we are made right before God. It's what allows us to go to heaven, right? And so Luther is not teaching a works-based salvation, but we are saved right through faith by grace, or by faith through grace, something like that. I should know how that is worded. But anyways, like Job, our justification before God is our ability to maintain, like Job does, God's goodness in the face of evil or suffering experiences in the world. So, not only does Silver's understanding of God as hidden vindicate Milton's God for me, it also helps me to understand my personal experiences, as well as the doctrine of justification, right? So I was very glad that I read from this book. Now, it's one thing that we can often slip into as humans is thinking about God as like a big old guy in the sky with like this big white beard, and we cast God in our own image, and as a result we start to judge God and judge God's actions and intents based on our own finite, flawed understanding of justice. And this is not fair of us, right? Like Job, we need to be reminded that, well, God is unlike us, and we cannot infer something about God based on our situation, or sort of question God's methods, right? So instead of using this opportunity of experiencing suffering or evil to condemn God, or even potentially condemn ourselves, we should use it as an opportunity to strengthen our faith and put more trust into God's plan, right? So, like Job, we are the ones that are in the wrong if we try to judge God based on our own understanding. And if we are facing evil or suffering, our best option is just to say, God, you're good, I trust you, and that's it. So yeah, anyways, I learned a lot with this class, and of course, the class was like an English literature class, but of John Milton writing a heavily theological work, you're bound to learn things about theology, not just literature, right? So yeah, it was a good experience. Anyways, everything I just said is put way more coherently in an essay that I wrote, and it'll be featured in the next January edition of the newsletter. So please subscribe, and yeah, see you next time.